There is a task sitting somewhere in your life right now, an email you haven't sent, a project you haven't started, a conversation you've been avoiding, a goal you've been meaning to begin since a date that has now passed so many times it has become a private joke between you and your own conscience. And you know exactly what it is. You have known for days or weeks or possibly months. And the knowing has not made the doing any easier. In fact, the knowing has somehow made the not doing worse, has added a layer of shame and self-judgment on top of the original avoidance until the task has accumulated so much psychological weight that approaching it feels genuinely impossible in a way that you cannot fully explain to anyone who asks why you simply haven't just done it yet. And today we are going to explain it completely and scientifically because the reason you procrastinate has been studied with extraordinary rigor by psychologists, neuroscientists, and behavioral researchers across 4 decades of serious academic inquiry. And what they have found is so different from what most people believe about procrastination that understanding it has the potential to end not just one episode of avoidance, but the entire pattern permanently by addressing the actual cause rather than the symptom that everyone can already see. The single most important scientific finding about procrastination, the one that changes everything once you genuinely understand it, is this. Procrastination is not a time management problem. It is not laziness. It is not poor planning. It is not a failure of discipline or motivation or intelligence or ambition. And it is definitively, conclusively, empirically not the result of not caring enough about the thing you are avoiding. In fact, the research consistently shows that procrastination is most severe on the tasks people care about most, which is itself a clue to its actual psychological nature. Procrastination is an emotion regulation problem. It is the brain's attempt to manage a specific set of negative emotions that have become associated with a specific task. And the avoidance is not the avoidance of the task itself, but the avoidance of how the task makes you feel, which is a completely different psychological problem with a completely different set of solutions than the time management interventions and productivity strategies that most procrastination advice consists of. This finding, most comprehensively articulated by psychologists Fushia Siroas at the University of Sheffield and Timothy Peikel at Carleton University, whose collaborative research on procrastination and emotion regulation represents the most current and most empirically robust framework for understanding the behavior, reframes the entire experience of procrastination from a moral failure to a psychological mechanism. And while that reframe does not make procrastination less costly or less important to address, it makes it genuinely explicable and genuinely addressable in ways that the moral failure framework never has and never will. Let's go inside the brain during a moment of procrastination. Because the neuroscience here is not just fascinating, it is directly prescriptive, meaning it tells you exactly what is happening and therefore exactly what needs to change. When you approach a task that your brain has tagged with negative emotional associations, anxiety about whether you will do it well enough, shame about how long you have already waited to start, boredom about the mundane effort the task requires, resentment about having to do something that doesn't feel freely chosen, overwhelm about the complexity and scope of what needs to be done. Your amygdala, which is the brain's primary threat detection and emotional processing center, registers those emotional associations as a form of danger and triggers the avoidance response that the brain uses to protect you from threatening stimuli. The brain does not distinguish with great sophistication between physical threats and emotional threats. The same fundamental avoidance mechanism that would cause you to step back from a cliff edge causes you to navigate away from the essay document and open something more emotionally comfortable. Because in both cases, the brain is registering a threat and executing its standard threat response protocol, which is to move away from the source of the threatening signal. The prefrontal cortex, which is capable of overriding this avoidance response through executive control, of saying, I know this feels uncomfortable, but it is important and I am going to do it anyway, can and does override the amygdala's avoidance signal, but only when it has sufficient cognitive resources available, and the depletion of those resources through decision fatigue, sleep deprivation, chronic stress, and the accumulated regulatory demands of modern life is precisely what makes evening procrastination so much more severe than morning procrastination for most people, and what makes procrastination worsen under high pressure periods rather than improving, which is the opposite of what the naive motivational model of procrastination would predict. Now, let's examine the specific emotional signatures that most reliably trigger procrastination, because naming them precisely is the first step toward interrupting them, and the research identifies a consistent and recognizable set of emotional experiences that cluster around the tasks most people most chronically avoid. The first and most powerful is fear of failure. Not the rational acknowledgement that failure is possible, but the deep, identity-threatening belief that if this attempt fails, it will constitute proof of something humiliating and permanent about your capability, your intelligence, your worth, or your right to pursue the goal the task is connected to. The task remains undone, not because you don't want to succeed, but because psychologically, an unfinished task cannot fail. And the not starting is the brain's sophisticated, if ultimately self-defeating strategy for protecting the self-concept from the verdict that a completed but inadequate attempt might deliver. This is why perfectionism and procrastination are so consistently correlated in the research. Perfectionism is not really about high standards. It is about the emotional impossibility of producing something that might fall short of the standard that feels necessary to justify the attempt, and procrastination is the behavioral consequence of the paralysis that this emotional impossibility produces. The second emotional driver is task aversion, the anticipation of a specific negative emotional experience during the task itself, whether that is boredom, frustration, mental effort, physical discomfort, or the specific unpleasant sensation of confronting your own current limitations in a domain where you wish you were already more capable. Research by Keikel and colleagues found that procrastinators do not uniformly avoid all tasks. They specifically avoid tasks that they anticipate experiencing as aversive, and they are relatively accurate in their prediction of which tasks will feel aversive, which means the procrastination is a rational short-term response to accurate emotional forecasting, even when it is an irrational long-term strategy for achieving the goals the tasks are connected to. The third emotional driver is the least discussed and perhaps the most insidious, and that is the emotional function that procrastination serves as a mood regulation strategy. In the immediate moment of avoidance, procrastination works. It removes the source of the threatening emotional signal. It provides access to more emotionally comfortable activities, and it produces a temporary but genuine improvement in mood that the brain registers as a reward, which through the mechanism of operant conditioning makes the procrastination behavior more likely to recur in future similar situations. This is why procrastination is so resistant to simple motivational intervention, because it is being reinforced on a moment-to-moment basis by the mood relief it provides. And the costs of procrastination, stress, guilt, reduced performance, missed opportunities, are delayed and diffuse compared to the immediate and concentrated reward of relief that the avoidance produces. The brain, which is wired to respond more powerfully to immediate consequences than delayed ones, receives a clear and consistent signal that procrastination is an effective strategy, which is neurologically much more influential than the abstract, future-oriented knowledge that it is ultimately self-defeating. Now, let's look at the temporal self-continuity research, because this body of work provides one of the most illuminating explanations for why procrastination is so universally human, and why the insight it offers is genuinely different from anything the productivity conversation typically provides. Research by Hal Hirschfield at UCLA, using neuroimaging to examine how people represent their future selves, found that when most people think about their future self, the neural activation pattern resembles the pattern produced when thinking about a stranger. A person who is emotionally disconnected from the present self, who is experienced as a separate entity with a separate identity, toward whom the present self has only abstract and limited emotional obligation. This finding has a direct and devastating implication for procrastination. When you delay a task to your future self, you are not experiencing this as self-sacrifice or self-discipline in the motivationally meaningful sense. You are experiencing it more like delegating an unpleasant task to a colleague you don't particularly identify with, which makes the delegation feel much easier and much less ethically significant than it would feel if you experienced your future self as continuous with and genuinely connected to who you are right now. The future version of you who will face the deadline panic, the all-nighter, the diminished output quality, the professional or personal consequences of the delay. That person feels neurologically like someone else's problem. And this psychological distance is one of the core neurological reasons that knowing better does not reliably produce doing better when it comes to procrastination. Now, let's get to the solutions. Because the scientific understanding of procrastination's emotional nature points directly toward a specific set of interventions that are meaningfully different from the generic productivity advice of break tasks into smaller pieces and use a timer that most procrastination content consists of, and whose effectiveness is grounded in their direct engagement with the emotional and neurological mechanisms that actually drive the behavior. The first and most immediately applicable solution is what researchers call emotion-first processing, addressing the emotional association with the avoided task before attempting to engage with the task itself. This sounds simple, but it is behaviorally profound. Instead of trying to force yourself to begin the task while the emotional resistance is fully activated, you first name the specific emotion you are experiencing in relation to the task, which neuroscientists call affect labeling, and which research by Matthew Lieberman at UCLA demonstrates reduces amygdala activation and increases prefrontal cortex engagement, producing a measurable reduction in the emotional intensity of the threat signal. Simply saying, internally or on paper, I am avoiding this because I am afraid that it won't be good enough, and that will feel humiliating, begins the process of converting an overwhelming, diffuse emotional threat into a specific, nameable, manageable psychological experience. And a specific, nameable experience is one the prefrontal cortex can engage with analytically, which is the neurological prerequisite for overriding the amygdala's avoidance instruction. The second solution, and this is the one with the most consistent empirical support across the procrastination research literature, is the implementation of what psychologist Peter Gollwitzer calls if-then planning. The pre-specification of exactly when, where, and how you will begin the avoided task in response to a specific contextual cue. If it is 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning and I have my coffee in my hand, then I will open the document and write one sentence before doing anything else. The if-then structure works not by increasing motivation, but by automating the initiation of the behavior in response to the specified trigger, bypassing the moment of emotional deliberation where the amygdala's avoidance signal has its opportunity to win. Research shows that if-then plans increase behavioral follow-through by 2 to 3 times compared to simple intention setting, and their effectiveness is specifically strongest for tasks that are aversive and emotionally charged, which is precisely the category of tasks that procrastination most severely affects. The third solution is the deliberate cultivation of self-compassion in response to procrastination. And I want to be precise about why the research consistently shows this to be more effective than self-criticism, because it runs counter to the intuition that most people have about what motivates behavioral change. Kristen Neff's research at the University of Texas on self-compassion demonstrates that people who respond to their own failures and inadequacies with kindness and understanding, rather than harsh self-judgment, show greater emotional resilience, greater willingness to acknowledge mistakes without defensiveness, and greater capacity for behavioral correction. Not because self-compassion is more pleasant than self-criticism, but because self-criticism activates the threat response system and increases the emotional aversiveness of the task, making future avoidance more likely, while self-compassion deactivates the threat response, reduces the emotional intensity of the negative associations, and makes returning to the task neurologically easier. The procrastinator who responds to their avoidance with, "I am terrible and lazy, and I always do this," is adding additional emotional weight to an already emotionally heavy situation, compounding the avoidance motivation with shame and self-condemnation that make the task feel even more threatening and the return to it even more neurologically costly. The procrastinator who responds with, "I can see that I am avoiding this because it feels scary, and that is a very human response, and I can choose to begin it anyway," is reducing the emotional threat signal, which reduces the amygdala's avoidance activation, which gives the prefrontal cortex more regulatory room to initiate the behavior. And finally, the most important truth that this entire video has been building toward, the truth that contains all the others and that points most directly toward the end of the procrastination pattern, rather than just the management of its next episode. You do not procrastinate because something is wrong with you. You procrastinate because your brain is doing exactly what brains do, protecting you from perceived emotional threat using the most immediately effective strategy available to it, which is avoidance. The problem is not the mechanism. The mechanism is working perfectly. The problem is the emotional associations that have accumulated around the tasks that matter most to you. Associations built from past experiences of failure, criticism, perfectionism, and the specific psychological history that makes certain kinds of effort feel dangerous rather than merely difficult. And those associations, not you, not your character, not your fundamental capacity for discipline or achievement, are what need to change. They change through self compassion rather than self condemnation. They change through the naming of specific emotions rather than the denial of them. They change through the pre committed behavioral plans that bypass the moment of emotional deliberation entirely. They change through the repeated, imperfect, patient experience of beginning the thing you were afraid to begin and discovering, as you always do, that the doing is never as emotionally terrible as the not doing, that the task is never as threatening from the inside as it appeared from the outside, and that the version of you who starts is always, without exception, more capable of finishing than the version of you who waited to feel ready. Because that version, the one who waits to feel ready, has been waiting their whole life. And ready is not a feeling that arrives before you begin. It is a feeling that is only ever found inside the beginning itself. Subscribe for more mind secrets.